has given us a purpose right from the beginning. Now, Adam and Eve had purpose, and theirs was to enjoy the relationship with God and to work the garden and to take care of it. They were to rule over the animals and birds and fish. They had a task to do. Actually, it's a good job description, that, isn't it? It's a really good job description. And then moving on to the New Testament, Paul, writing in Romans, says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." So we're called and we have a purpose. That's what it tells us. Now, sometimes we use the word calling in relation to a vocation, something that we do at work. It can be within the church or a different Christian setting, or it can be in retail, food industry, design. We've heard about some of those vocations this morning from Laura and Brendan. It can be in a lot of different fields. It could be mission to overseas. We mean by that we have a set of skills and talents that have generally drawn us to a particular area to use those in. And sometimes you hear, well, it was what I was made for. It's, the set and the skills and the purpose that you feel, that's just me, that's what I've got to do. Not everybody has a strong sense of that calling, but they may have a sense of what things are a good fit for them, the things that they have a heart for. Or we may feel called to one of the roles mentioned in Ephesians. God gave some to be apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors and teachers to prepare people for works of service. And in this way, God is putting people in particular places or particular roles to serve in a particular way. But the verse in Romans, though, isn't using calling in that sort of way. It really is an invitation to come to God. It means if you've been without God before, if you're away from me, come to me, turn to me, and receive the forgiveness and new life that I offer. So we are all called. He's sending out an invitation to all of us. And then in Ephesians 2 we read, "For we are all God's workmanship, created in Christ to do good works that he has prepared in advance for us to do." So we have a calling, a general invitation to come, and there are good works that are prepared for us to do. Now, these good works could include some of the individual callings, the ones that we've mentioned, but it's much wider than that. Works actually means actions or good deeds, different kinds of tasks. So it might mean that I offer to get some shopping for somebody, or do a bit of weeding, offer some friendship. And we've had a great example of that from Jean this morning, buying some flowers. That was a work that she had prepared for her to do. What a great example that was. So we may not particularly have a strong sense of a individual or particular calling, and it might take us a while to discover that. And we might think, well, my contribution isn't really as important as somebody else's, what do I do? Now, I know that I happen to be standing here this morning. One of the other things I do is buy toilet rolls for the church office and make sure that there's some in the cupboard. Now, I wouldn't say, and by the way, pal, I've got some in the back of the car to go down after. going down today. I wouldn't say I have a ministry in toilet rolls, necessarily. But I can tell you, the people that use the office and work there, it's a huge blessing to them. And if I were to ask them, would you prefer I did this or bought the toilet rolls? Do you know what? I think I'd know what they would say. So some of these things that we do are a real, real blessing. It doesn't have to be a great thing. And even if we have one of those individual callings that we feel strongly about, it doesn't mean we don't take part in those wider things. Now, Jesus gives us some very simple blueprint that speaks of our purpose. In Mark, we read, Jesus is asked by one of the teachers of the law, of all the commandments, which is the most important? The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second one is love your neighbour as yourself. There is no greater commandment than this. That trumps everything else. In other words, love me with your attitudes, words, thoughts, choices, behaviours, time, resources, everything you do, everything in you, and care for those I have created. And as we become more like him and love him with all that was in us, we pour out love, his love, out to others. And that's our purpose in a nutshell. And everybody is included in that. So our purpose begins with being rooted in our relationship with Jesus. So if we could have the next slide, please. Now this here, this is part of the work of a man called Frank Lake. He was both a medical doctor and a missionary, and he spent many years then being a tutor and lecturer in pastoral theology. So this is part of his work. I have actually simplified it for our purposes today, because otherwise it would have been a bit complicated. But this is about the life of Jesus. Now, on the corner, on the bottom left-hand corner, you can see that up on that side it says, being as the Son of God, accepted and assured by the Father. Now, when Jesus was born, he was born into Mary and Joseph, and he was born knowing that his being, his very self, his very being was rooted in being the Son of God. He started in that place, and he grew up in that place. And he knew the acceptance of God, and he knew he was assured of God's acceptance all the time. He was loved at all times by the Father. His existence, his very existence, was rooted in the Father. And then we go up to the top bit. And following on from that, his well-being was developed out of his acceptance and his being as the Son of God. And he lived in the sustenance of the Father, who sustained him in all levels of his life and being. He learnt, in other words, to abide in the Father. And then we come down out of his well-being, out of that abiding in the Father. He was grounded in who he was. He was grounded in his status as the Son of God. And and he was motivated to love as he had been loved. He was one with his Father. And out of that, along the bottom, is the outworking of his purpose, which for him included huge sacrifice. So if we look at the top in part, that's he was taking in, he was abiding in the Father, living in the Father's love. And the out part, the doing part, came out of that. He was being before he was doing. Now for us, there is a huge temptation to try to work this backwards. And we start thinking, if we can find a purpose, if I can just push that square thing into the round hole, I might have a purpose. Then I might feel that I've got some kind of status. I might understand what my identity is. Then I might feel that I've got some well-being if I can find status. And then if I find my well-being, maybe I'll be accepted. And we try to work the whole thing the wrong way round. Now, there are a few reasons that we might do that. Society gives us a hugely distorted idea of what purpose is and how we should find it. And it's usually some kind of achievement or fitting in, the things that we have to do to be like other people or to prove we can do. Society has some really particular views about achievement and what our purpose should look like. And another thing is that sometimes we haven't been able to connect with the message of being and well-being in our own background. We haven't really been able to feel solid about that. Now that doesn't mean we've necessarily had a bad childhood or a bad family, but maybe these messages of well-being haven't just been displayed or shown to us in a way that might mean something to us. And so rather than having connected with the being and well-being in our growing up place, we are looking for that in a different kind of place. We start to look for it in the things that we do. If we could have that back again. We start to look for it in the things that we do in the hope that we will find it. And it then becomes very easy to be reliant on what makes us feel good. To find something that makes us feel good so that we have that sense of well-being. And the third thing is that often we're just geared up to doing rather than being. And we get used to being in that doing phase, but not really being in the being phase. So there are various different reasons that we can find ourselves in the position of trying to work out our purpose and going back to the beginning. But when we try to work the cycle backwards, one thing it can do is that it can lead us to put too much emphasis on our individual giftings. Too much emphasis on the thing that is really me, that I have to find to do, that will give me purpose and identity. And then we neglect wider calling that is around that. Now, it's not that those individual callings are not important, because they are, but those are never meant to provide us with our sense of well-being and identity. That comes from being rooted in our relationship with God. Now, 20 years ago when I was quite ill, I know that there were a lot of people that prayed for me. And one of those people was an older gentleman that isn't with us now, he's with the Lord now. But I know that he prayed for me every day. And when he was getting really elderly and he couldn't go out, and it was only about five years ago, a little bit before he died, he said to me, "How are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm keeping really well, thank you." And he said, "I don't pray for you every day now, but you are still on my list and I pray for you every single week." That is 15 years, And I attribute the fact that I am as well as I am because people prayed for me, and he just made that sacrificial time to pray for me. And that was really special. And I didn't know he was doing that. And I think when we make these sacrifices that are about loving our neighbour as ourselves, God moves the heavens. Something happens with that. And those things are precious to him. Showing someone acceptance when they've never felt it before. Buying flowers for somebody because we've noticed that they're in a bad place. Those things have a profound effect. It's not always the big things. It's not always the showy things. But the things that we do that are the good works that God has prepared for each of us to do, those things often are the very profound things that contribute to God's kingdom and his glory. Now, the teacher, Solomon presumed to be, at the end of his searching, at the end of Ecclesiastes, concludes, "Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of man." Quite simple. So in other words, love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. There are plenty of good works prepared for us all to do. And if we root our identity and our being in him, all the rest flows out, just like it did for Jesus. What is within us, that he's putting within us, will flow out. And as we love others, and if we root ourselves with him and follow the purpose around, he will give us what we need at the time when we love others. He will equip us with what we need. But we don't look for those things first and work it backwards. So the world would teach us to look for purpose in particular ways. It's not the ways of God. He wants us to experience his purpose in the way that he designed us. And everybody is included in that.